Right, thanks for waiting. Good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Rich. I'm a bookseller here. We host tons of events every month, in store as well as partnered events, trips and classes, and you can find it all on our website. We also have handouts at the front of the store as well as a big calendar that you can't miss. I'm just going to run over a few things before we get started today. If you've not already done so, if you can silence your cell phone, turn it off, just so we don't disrupt the event, that'd be great. Once we get time for the Q&A, we've got a standing microphone just to the right of this pillar here. So if you can be sure to make sure you speak into the microphone. We are live streaming and record the event today, so we want to hear your questions on that as well. And if you've not already done so, you can purchase the book down at the checkout, and then we'll have a sign up here at this table. Again, we'll ask you to line up to the right of the pillar. We'll come by, ask if you want any personalizations just to speed it up a bit. And then once the event's finished, if we could just ask to fold your chairs up, lean them against something sturdy just to help us out a bit, that'd be great. All right, so without further ado, we're very excited to be welcoming Kaveh Akbar. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Paris Review, Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. He is the author of 2 poetry collections, Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf a Wolf, in addition to a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. Martyr is his first foray into writing a novel, and it's not to be missed. He transfers his lyricism to gorgeous prose, creating characters harbouring complicated stories. It's a book brimming with ideas, bizarre dreams, and the poetry of martyrdom. We booksellers love it here. Everyone that's read it has loved it, and it's going to be one of the standouts of the year for sure. And Akbar will be in conversation with Clint Smith. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic and an accomplished poet in his own right. His most recent collection, entitled Above Ground, was released last year. And he is also the author of the excellent narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, which was a New York Times #1 bestseller. So please join me in welcoming Kaveh Akbar and Clint Smith.
Oh, way more of you than I thought it was like this and like, wow. Hi, everybody. Wonderful to see you all. I'm going to just read. My name is Kaveh Akbar. It's wonderful to meet you all. I'm going to just read just briefly, and then my dear friend Clint will come out and we'll chop it up for a bit, and then there will be ample opportunity, inshallah, for us to interface as well. If you guys have questions, comments, complaints, you'll be able to levy them against me. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it, sincerely. I'm just going to read, you don't need to know anything. These are just the opening couple pages of the novel. Maybe it was that Cyrus had done the wrong drugs in the right order, or the right drugs in the wrong order. But when God finally spoke back to him after 27 years of silence, what Cyrus wanted more than anything else was a do-over. Clarification. Lying on his mattress that smelled like piss and Febreze, in his bedroom that smelled like piss and Febreze, Cyrus stared up at the room's single light bulb, willing it to blink again, willing God to confirm that the bulb's flicker had been a divine action and not just the old apartment's trashy wiring. Flash it on and off, Cyrus had been thinking, not for the first time in his life. Just a little wink and I'll sell all my shit and buy a camel. I'll start over. All his shit at that moment amounted to a pile of soiled laundry and a stack of books borrowed from various libraries and never returned. Poetry and biographies. To the Lighthouse. My Uncle Napoleon. Never mind all that, though. Cyrus meant it. Why should the Prophet Muhammad get a whole visit from an archangel? Why should Saul get to see the literal light of heaven on the road to Damascus? Of course it would be easy to establish bedrock faith after such clear-cut revelation. How was it fair to celebrate those guys for faith that wasn't faith at all, that was just obedience to what they plainly observed to be true? And what sense did it make to punish the rest of humanity who had never been privy to such explicit revelation? To make everyone else lurch from crisis to crisis, desperately alone. But then, it happened for Cyrus too. right there in that ratty Indiana bedroom. He asked God to reveal himself, herself, themself, itself, whatever. He asked with all the earnestness at his disposal, which was troves. If every relationship was a series of advances and retreats, Cyrus was almost never the retreater, sharing everything important about himself at a word, a smile, with a shrug as if to say, those are just facts. Why should I be ashamed? He'd lain there on the bare mattress on the hardwood floor, letting his cigarette ash on his bare stomach like some sulky prince, thinking, turn the lights on and off, Lord, and I'll buy a camel. I promise I'll buy a donkey and ride him to Medina, to Gethsemane, wherever. Just flash the lights and I'll figure it out, I promise. He was thinking this, and then something happened. The light bulb flickered, or maybe it got brighter like a camera's flash going off across the street. Just a fraction of a second like that. And then it was back to normal, just a regular yellow bulb. Cyrus tried to recount the drugs he'd done that day. The standard bouquet of booze, weed, cigarettes, Klonopin, Adderall, Neurontin, variously throughout the day. He had a couple Percocets left, but he'd been saving them for later that evening. None of what he'd taken was exotic, nothing that would make him out and out hallucinate. He felt pretty sober, in fact, relative to his baseline. He wondered if it had maybe been the sheer weight of his wanting or his watching that strained his eyes till they saw what they'd wanted to see. He wondered if maybe that was how God worked now in the new world. Tired of interventionist pyrotechnics like burning bushes and locust plagues, maybe God now worked through the tired eyes of drunk Iranians in the American Midwest, through CVS handles of bourbon and little pink pills with G31 written on their side. Cyrus took a pull from the giant plastic Old Crow bottle. The whiskey did for him what a bedside table did for normal people. It was always at the head of his mattress, holding what was essential to him in place. It lifted him daily from the same sleep it eventually set him into. Lying there reflecting on the possible miracle he just experienced, Cyrus asked God to do it again. Confirmation, like typing your password in twice to a web browser. Surely if the all-knowing creator of the universe had wanted to reveal themselves to Cyrus, there'd be no ambiguity. Cyrus stared at the ceiling light, which in the fog of his cigarette smoke looked like a watery moon, and waited for it to happen again. But it didn't. Whatever sliver of a flicker he had or hadn't perceived didn't come back. And so, lying there in the stuffy haze of relative sobriety, itself a kind of high, amidst the underwear and cans and dried piss and empty orange pill bottles and half-read books held open against the hardwood, breaking their spines to face away, Cyrus had a decision to make.
How's everybody doing this evening? We were just we were talking earlier today about how we live in this era where it feels like this sort of tiny miracle that like people continue to read books and like show up for books and like come to events like this. I mean, because as you put it, right, the opportunity cost of spending time with a novel is different than it was 50 years ago when it's like, what am I going to do? Like listen to the radio or like, you know, play with the stick. Like, you know, and now you know, as you said it, you were like, you could learn how to like order from a restaurant in French, like in the same amount of time it takes you to.
I mean, imagine how many Duolingo lessons you could do in the 12 hours that it takes you to read a novel. You know what I mean? Like you could get like some passing, I'm not joking, like you could get like passingly conversational in a new to you language in the time it takes. You know, you could watch any band perform on YouTube. You could watch any movie ever made, right? You could, I mean, the opportunity cost of reading has never been greater. And so the gift of people showing up, of people buying books, the gift of time, which is your most irreplenishable resource, right? You can make more money, you can make more friends, you can make more whatever, but like time is your most irreplenishable resource, and you're giving that to an artist. That's a profound gift, right? That is a profound gift, and I think that you are owed a measure of delight and a measure of instruction, which is just me cribbing Horace. But the comedian Richard Pryor also said he wanted to get you laughing so that your mouth would be open, so that your mouth would be open when he poured the poison down, which is also Richard Pryor cribbing Horace, who said "Dulce et utile," which is like delight and instruct. Anyways, yes, it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be here.
I was going to say. So that's all a very Kaveh Akbar way of saying thank you for coming.
I really am great, like sincerely.
Yeah.
And Clint is one of my best friends on the planet Earth. He's been involved with early manuscript versions of this novel, like just reading PDFs, and it's my incredible. I went to his PhD dissertation defense. You know what I mean? Like we've been together for a minute, right?
Yeah.
So it's my luck to get to be here with my friend and with all of you, new friends, right?
We watched the Bucks play. Your favorite
Yeah,
basketball team. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, if you want to get real about it, I really love basketball, and Clint really loves everything. He's like one of the most curious people I've ever met. But like, he did an event with the Milwaukee Bucks, which happens to be my basketball team. If any of you know the Bucks, it's like a great time to be a Bucks fan right now, but has historically not been a very good time to be a Bucks fan my whole life. And he was doing an event with them, and he brought me as his +1, so I got to sit like feet on the hardwood courtside with like Chris Middleton, like just shooting 3 feet in front of me. Yeah, it was so cool. It was one of the great like friend days of my life.
That was fun. We could talk about the Bucks.
Yeah, talk to us in the signing line.
But exactly. But so I've seen, as you mentioned, like I've seen multiple iterations of this book. I've seen it, I feel like, from sort of evolve and blossom and transition and take on all sorts of different iterations. Can you talk a little bit about how the sort of idea for this book began, where it started, and did you always imagine it in the form that it took? Which is to say, did you think maybe it was going to be a short story, or maybe was it going to be a series of poems, or was it always going to be a novel? How did it all come together?
Yeah. I mean, the earliest, I write everything by hand, which is a really terrible habit because I'm also terribly unorganized, and so I just write on anything. I travel all the time, so I'm writing on like hotel notepads and legal pads and backs of menus and stuff like this. And so a lot of the times I'll have finished something or I'll publish something, and then I'll find like a stray draft, and I'm like, oh, that would have been so much better. You know what I mean? Like I'll find just like a loose paper that has a better draft of the thing that I eventually published. But so the very earliest drafts, the very earliest recognizable drafts were just conversations, almost these sort of like Socratic exercises of like working out some thoughts, right? Which were interesting to me, but had nothing in the form of narrative. In other words, there was no reason that it would be like handing my diary to you. You know, it's interesting to me, but there's no reason for anyone else to be interested in it, right? And I realized that in order to, I was sort of putting my hands in the sock puppets and having them sort of talk to each other. And in order to test out ideas that I was thinking about, I had to create countervalent or oppositional forces between these in these conversations, right? And I'm like almost describing evolution, right? Like that, and then it crawled onto land and developed lungs, right? And so these characters started forming, right, in order for them to hold oppositional ideas and be able to argue compellingly. Because if people are just like trying out an idea and the other person's like, yep, I agree, that's not a very, and so, and then once I had characters, I could begin to create scenes, right? I could begin to create, and so it was truly just this. I had no superstructure in mind, right? I just wrote, and I'm someone who writes all the time and publishes very little, and so. There are probably 1,500 pages of this, right? Like the fact that it is a novel now wouldn't seem remarkable at all if you knew how many pages are just not. And like it's like 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters will eventually make Hamlet. You know what I mean? Like I'm not saying this is Hamlet, but I'm saying, right? Like it's just statistically, eventually you're going to come up with a novel, right? It's like the Borgesian library.
I think there's we've talked about this in our group chat, but I think there's some questions about Kaveh's faith in the monkeys to eventually sit in a room and produce Hamlet. But I like it as a thought exercise.
Infinite monkey.
Yes. Good luck to the monkeys. I wish them luck. And so, but what's interesting is that you talked about, you just alluded to this idea of having ideas sort of manifest in the text or in these dialogues you were forming, and then having other characters who were saying things in opposition to some of the ideas that you were espousing. And I think that that's one of the unique things about a novel that is different from an essay or different from a work of nonfiction, different from a polemic in which you, as the writer, have a set of political or ideological beliefs in which you espouse, and then are ostensibly trying to convince people to also believe. Whereas in a novel, it's, and you do this in this text so well, it's like I can hear in different characters some of the things that I'm like, oh, this is what Kaveh thinks. But then I also see you take the other characters and do this sort of like, I don't know what anybody do debate growing up, like debates, like it's when you're supposed to argue, like you don't know if you're going to argue, if the death penalty is good or bad, but you have to be prepared to do both. And it's kind of like you're doing a little bit of that 100%. In the book, which I thought was like just it is one of the ways in which like the novel so beautifully like fit with the way that your mind works. Because I know that like in conversation with you, you're always saying this, but also you have to consider this. To see that manifest itself in the characters was
that's
really
beautiful.
Wonderful.
I love thinking about. I mean, that's a very generous observation, and I'm grateful for it. Yeah, I mean, a thing that feels anathema to creativity right now is certainty. Right? I feel like the only people who speak in certainty are zealots and tyrants, right? This all immigrants are criminals, and this Rolex will make you sexually irresistible, and you know what I mean? Like this is the language of certainty, right? And there's a way in which there's a kind of rhetorical hygienics in place in the sort of shortened discourse of social media, because there's not enough space for nuance and not enough space for countervalent forces to take place, right? And so we start speaking to each other in the language of certain. I mean, like if you want to get like real granular about it, like the English language has 4 kinds of sentences, right? We have declarative, imperative, interrogative, and exclamatory, right? The 2 most common of those are declarative and imperative, right? We walk around declaring things, and imperative is like, go do this or go do that, right? So we declare things and then we say, go do this, go do that, right? Those are 2 very, very certain forms of language, right? That are just strutting around certain as roosters, right? Like just like being like, go do this, go do that. This is true, that is true, right? That's how we talk to each other, right? That is the algorithm of our discourse, right? That is our instrument, right? And that using the English language to try to get to a place of sitting in uncertainty without groping desperately to resolve it feels like a task for which the English language is uniquely ill-suited. And that really interests me as an artist.
When you were, basically this book is like the opposite of Twitter. And so if you're like, I spend too much time scrolling Twitter, then put Twitter down and open it.
So like you say that as like a funny thing, but it's actually like, I mean, not this book, but like books in general, right? Like the language shit. I'm sorry, I get excited about this stuff and I get excited about talking to Clint, but like the language of Twitter is the language of empire being shot at you from a fire hose, right? It's like, here's an ad for toilet paper. Here's an ad for blue jeans. Here's an autoplay snuff film of state murder of an unarmed civilian. Here's take on the new Marvel movie. Here's an ad for some TV show, right? And it's like you scroll like this and you do this, and it's teaching you that language doesn't have integrity and language doesn't have history, and it's teaching you to metabolize each of those beats the same way, right? What literature asks you to do is slow down your metabolization of language, right? You read a poem, and there's no way you read a poem as quickly as you read Twitter. You know what I'm saying? Like it organically forces you to just slow down your metabolization of language, right? Which reminds you that language has integrity, that language has materiality, right? Like the act of reading is the opposite of Twitter. I mean, I really do think that that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, this book is not any more particular example of it than Hop on Pop. You know what I'm saying? Like just the act of reading.
Another great work of literature. Hop on Pop.
Listen, it endures, right? It endures.
One of the things that I was thinking about as we've been kind of talking about this book over the years, is how there's like, I think, an idea that people have of what one assumes to be like the poet's novel, right? And like, oh, a poet wrote a novel, that's so sweet, like it's gonna be, you know, like what is plot? Like, plot doesn't matter, like the plot of our soul,
What
right?
is what is plot? What is plot but the drawing of a line?
Right, like at that leaf falling from the tree, like that is all the plot we need. And so in some way, and I don't mean that
Such a good line. I love that.
I don't mean this is being live streamed. I don't mean that in like a shady way. Somebody's gonna be like, Clint was talking shit. I don't mean that in a shady way at all. I love many. We were talking before about books I love that don't have a plot, and that's just like are propelled narratively by other forces.
Well, one of your favorite books is Open City by Teju Cole, which like nothing big really happens.
No, exactly.
I love Nicholson Baker, who is like a novelist who just describes going up an elevator for an entire escalator for a whole novel.
100%. I love the flaneur. I love like a person walking and observing, and just that means a lot to me. And I think what is so unique about this book is that I remember as I was like live texting him as I read this book.
Honestly, one of my favorite experiences that I've had in the entire process of making this book was just, there were certain moments in the book that are a little twisty-turny, and I just would get like an explosion of 15 texts from Clint that's like, what the fuck?
But it was like, the amazing thing about this book is that it's like so beautiful and gorgeous, and the sentences are lush, and the thoughts are, they're these sort of like existential and philosophical, sort of extemporaneous, like, he's walking down the street and is wondering about these questions that are at the center of our existence. And the plot is like John Grisham. Like, it's wild. I mean, you're like, you're reading, and then you turn the page and you're like, oh snap, she is her and that was that. And I really texted him. I was like, man, this is like Walt Whitman meets John Grisham. Like, it was an amazing thing. And so can you talk a little bit about that part of it, right? Like what it meant to, that wasn't just like you studied novels deeply. And because you very specifically did not want to write the sort of stereotypical conception of what a poet's novel was. You wanted something that carried other dynamics as well.
Yeah. I mean, I will watch anything in a movie theater, right? Like literally it doesn't matter how bad the movie is. Like I think that part of my brain has just never gotten over seeing supernaturally beautiful people really big, But I just love movies, right? And I love being told stories, you know what I mean? And I love Teju Cole. I love Open City. I love Nicholson Baker, and I love W.G. Sebald, and I love there are so many writers that I love where nothing really happens in their books, but it's what happens is internal, not external, right? But I'm not one of those writers, right? Like I want to tell stories, I love being told stories. I've never gotten over being read to, my spouse and I read to each other, and I just like being told stories. When we wake up every morning, I always ask my spouse, "Did you dream?" And like I just get to start my day with some days if they dreamt with
That's
them.
Great. All of you should take that back home to your partners.
I mean, you just get to start your day with being told a story. You know what I mean? Like, what? That's awesome. That rules. So I say this to say I wanted to, do I think that when people say poet's novel or lyric novel, what they mean is a novel with very pretty sentences sometimes, right? Which condescends both to novels and to poetry, right? Because it like the idea that novels can rise to the level of poetry, like a sufficiently beautiful language becomes poetry is not what, that's not what either of those things are, right? Like thinking of beauty as the horizon of art or the horizon towards which art must ineffably approach is a very European and fairly modern idea, right? When the 16th century land barons of Europe realized that their crops withered in the winter and didn't have any lovely flowers to look at, they would commission paintings of their estate so that they could look at the lovely, foliage even when it was cold outside, right? And so like beauty became this horizon towards which art might approach, right? Instead of, storytelling, instead of like the griots or indigenous Antipodean cultures that would pass, medical knowledge or or historical knowledge on vases. I mean, like every other culture used art to transmit data outside of their brains, right? To store data outside of the two lobes of their brains, right? And then this idea that beauty is the horizon towards which art must approach is relatively new. I mean, it obviously dominates contemporary thinking about visual art, especially. I mean, not contemporary if you want to think about. But anyways, what am I talking about?
Novel propelled plot.
Yeah. So this idea that like a novel can be just like this sort of nebulous miasma cloud of pretty language, right? Like, I think that poetry probably prepared me pretty well to do that. Like, I can make gnomic sounding oracular utterances. I can write 80,000 words of that, but why would a reader stay with that past page 2 when they can also be watching, The Sopranos? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want this novel to feel like a vegetable, you know what I mean? Like that you have to eat it because it's good for you. You know what I mean? I want to earn your time, right? It's that Richard Pryor thing, right? Like, there are ideas here that are really, really important to me about addiction and recovery and about legacy and about language and about empire, right? That I really do try to work through. But you're giving me the gift of your time, and I owe you a measure of delight, which doesn't mean like pink baby toes or puppies wagging tails, right? Delight means an encounter with something new, an encounter with surprise. I owe you a measure of delight with instruction, right? So I wanted to tell a story like the movies that I like. Clint alluded to like that narrative diet. I was watching a movie a day and reading 2 novels a week through the course of writing this as a way to just like stay suffused in these like beats of storytelling, right? To just be thinking about how people get characters into elevators and how people pick up the tab at the bar and how, you know what I mean? Like, just this stuff doesn't enter into poetry, really. You don't have these moments in poetry. And so learning how to do that was exhilarating. It was thrilling.
And I think that that's something in a different way. Like, for me, when I transition, that sounds dramatic, but like you are working across genre, and your previous books were in poetry, and this was a novel, and for me it was going from poetry to narrative nonfiction. And so, but it is interesting because you have those moments where you have to think about what, like for me in particular, it's like what does it mean to, I was like, oh, I need to describe what people are like doing with their hands in between the things they say, or like what's happening in how are they moving their eyebrows, or what are they doing with their body, what are the sensory details. And those are the things that I learned. Almost for my own book, I was consuming novels in the same way. Like, novels were teaching me, because for me it was like, how can I write a book of history that is similarly like propelled by a narrative, that feels engaging, that feels dynamic. And for me that was like, how do I make these characters, these people I'm meeting, these places I'm going, come alive? And so much of it is that exposition, those sensory details, and those small moments that the best novelists do. It's like the small moments in between, right? Like their nostril flared after they said something, or their like the vein in their neck bulged after they said something that was a lie, and you only know that by studying. And I think that's when I go talk to young writers, I think that's something I always really emphasize, because whenever we had like a famous writer come when I was in like high school or college or something, and I'd be like, people would ask, what's the main thing, like what's the best piece of advice you can give? And they'd be like, read, you have to read. And like, that's not what a 16-year-old wants to hear. I was like, I want the secret. Like, everybody tells me to read. Like, I want something, give me something good. But then you become a writer and you're like, no, it's actually just reading. Like, it's just read. Like, the more you read, like the more you are truly, it's like the human version of like you chat GPT, but like, I guess like, you have to consume more. Like, the more you consume, oh man, like right? No, that's where we are, and technologically, the human version of ChatGPT.
No, wait, but I mean, I love that so much, and it is just the most maddeningly linear thing in the world. There's no secret handshake or shibboleth, or I think that when I was young, I wanted someone to be like, oh yeah, just walk around an oak tree 6 times backwards under a full moon while muttering your mother's maiden name, and then like run into, you know what I mean? Like, and then suddenly you'll be a good, but it's just read. It's just like, I learned how to write poetry in the 811.5 section of my library. Like I didn't learn it in a classroom. I didn't learn it from I learned it by reading everything that I could pull off the shelf. But I wanted to say too, I mean, in How the Word is Passed, like that is what differentiates that book from The Field, right? Is like you're doing the thing with the Delight and Instruct. You are doing these little beats of what the wind was doing to the branches against the windshield of car, or you were doing these beats of like what the women were doing with their hands at Monticello while you were talking to them, and you could see them becoming visibly uncomfortable, and you know what I mean, and so it almost becomes this. I think that Tommy Orange is a fiction writer who I admire so much for doing the same thing, where you guys can put like a 2 or 3 page manifesto. Like here's my thought. Like Tommy will do like, here's my thoughts on blood quantum and indigeneity, and it'll be like a 3-page essay that you could just like pull out and put in GQ, almost like word for word. But you don't even notice it because the language around it is so intoxicating and so. It's like the magician disappearing the Kia right before I don't know why Kia. I'm thinking of like Blake Griffin jumping over a Kia, but it's like that thing, right? And that's what differentiates it from The Field, where you read a lot of creative nonfiction and it's like a lot of statistics and they're telling you a story, but it's like, okay, like I'm learning right now. I'm in school and I like being in school, but I'm in school. You know what I mean? Whereas reading How the Word is Passed, it feels like reading, again, it just feels like I'm just in this world.
I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. You can get my book at the. No, I'm kidding.
You can though.
No, but
yeah, look, someone back there.
they're literally holding it right on time. It's like when we're going on so many asides, but that moment felt like when like somebody, like a late night TV host, says something and then they just have the person who's like ready to pull it out. And it's like a bowl of Jello, and somebody runs out and they like have a bowl of Jello. You all should prepare to ask your own questions. I'm going to ask probably one more, and then I also want you all to get the opportunity to ask this brilliant mind whatever question is on.
You can also ask Clint questions.
You shouldn't ask me any questions. How did you? One of the things that I think about. I wrote this piece for The Atlantic a couple months ago, sort of re-examining Uncle Tom's Cabin. And you and I were talking about that when I was writing it, but like it was interesting for me because I'm really interested in what it means for a writer as the person to have a deep set of political and ideological beliefs, and values and things that are deeply embedded in their consciousness, with regard to like how they move through the world. And then what it means for them to write in a way, and you kind of alluded to this previously and when we were talking about, certainty and lack of certainty. But what's interesting about a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin is that you read it and you're like, oh, well, this person is attempting to convince me that slavery was bad, right? And James Baldwin has a whole thing. He wrote a whole essay. He was like, that's not art. That's a pamphlet, right? That's a 700-page pamphlet. And like, that's fine, but like what happens is that you flatten the characters and they become sort of like ideological pawns in service of what you are attempting to convey. You are someone who is among the most thoughtful, ethical, moral people I know, who who is always asking and wrestling with questions of right and wrong and who you are in relationship to the sort of ecosystem of ethics. And so I'm curious for you, as you wrestled with like some big, like both personal and like geopolitical issues in this text, what did it feel like to attempt to hold, I don't know if nuance is the right word, but like to hold all of that together and to not allow your own ideological sensibilities to overwhelm the text? Because it's not as if they're not present, but I think that one of the successes of the book is that they are present in a way that doesn't distract from the other questions at the center of the book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, obviously that's a very generous way to frame that question, and I'm grateful for it. I mean, I think that we were sort of talking about this at dinner, but I'm a person in recovery. It's the least secret thing about me. Like literally, like you can Google it and it might be the literal first thing that comes up. But I've been in recovery for 10 years and change, and a huge. I mean, all this shit, like all the me sitting in front of microphones with like luminaries and talking to captive audiences. Like this is like the tip of the, my actual life is working with people in recovery. You know what I mean? Like that is what I actually do. Like this is like the shit that allows me to keep my dog in the expensive kibble from the vet. You know what I mean? But like the work that I do in this world is I work with newcomers in recovery, and I have elders in recovery who work with me, and I take meetings into carceral institutions and halfway facilities, and that is my actual life, right? And I say this to say, every single night I make an inventory of like what I did that day. Where was I fearful? Where, is there something that I did today that I should tell at least one person about? Where was I dishonest? You know what I mean? And because, such behaviors are the dubious luxuries of normal people, but for me, they're poison, right? And I want to be alive. I was given this life despite the fact that I was no more ethically pure than so many of the people with whom I drank and used who didn't make it, right? I drove blackout drunk dozens of times and luckily never hurt anybody, but, I didn't make any ethical decision that was different than someone who did, you know what I'm saying? And so I'm here playing with house money, right? And I want to approach that with a spirit of service. And that's really, really important to me. And so thinking about that, it's very easy for me to sound like I sound right now, which is like very high-minded and didactic and, like, oh, I got to make sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to do all the time, but that's my voice in my head. But I also think we're in this funny moment of ethical infantilization, right? After, I'm going to get like real tinfoil hat here, but I promise I'll bring it back. After 2001, right, we have the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, which is what set off the whole Marvelification of cinema. Lord of the Rings and the first Harry Potter movie, the first Lord of the Rings movie and the first Harry Potter movie all debuted that year, right? Within a year of 9/11, right? What does that tell you, right? I mean, and the fact that they were so resoundingly successful, right? We were so baffled by this evil that we were being told hated us because of our freedom, which I think even at the time, most people were like, what is that? You know what I mean? And we were so baffled by that the cleanness of, this I don't know anything about Marvel movies, but like the Captain America is like this unimpeachable good guy, and there's the status quo in the city and everything's great, and then some guy Thanos comes in from Mars. I don't know anything about Marvel. Thanos comes in from Mars and and then disrupts the status quo, and then Captain America punches Thanos back to Mars, and then we're like back to.
I would read that version.
But you know what I mean? And then we're back to the status quo, right? Like reversion to the status quo, like glorification of the status quo, mythologization of the status quo is a fundamentally conservative position, right? That's a fundamentally regressive position, right? There's a reason why 20 years of pop culture were dominated by that, right? Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, right? There's a reason why we're just kind of now starting to get burnt out on Marvel movies, right? I don't think that's a coincidence, and I think that you can track its effects on pop ethics throughout all of the important social movements that have happened therein, right? Both on the right and on the left, and that sort of ethical infantilization makes for really bad art, right? It just makes for, it makes for good brochures. Sometimes we need to just be told that we're behaving poorly, right, in an uncomplicated way. But it tends to be the case that with literature especially, there's a synapse between what is being said and what should be being done, or what should be, and across that synapse is where the charge fires and illumination happens, right? And so there's a scene I always think about in Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, where Charlie Breed. This is trigger warning for racialized violence. But there's a scene in which Charlie Breedlove, the father of Piccolo Breedlove, is having sex with a young woman in the wood. I mean, those of you who have read Bluest Eye know the scene in which I'm talking about. He's having sex with a woman in the woods. It's his first time having sex, and these two white guys on a truck come up and shine their lights on them, and they're like, "Keep going," right? And they're like, "Keep going," right? And Morrison writes, in that moment, I'm not gonna be able to get the quote exactly right, but to paraphrase it, he's like, in that moment, Charlie couldn't hate himself because no man truly hates himself. And he couldn't hate them because he knew that was a hate. He couldn't hate the white men because he knew that was a hate that would destroy him. So he hated her. I'm getting goosebumps talking about that, right? That's the sort of like ethical complexity that feels so nourished. And then he's a monster in the rest of the book, right? Like he's a monster in the rest. I mean, those of you who've read Bluest Eye know that Charlie Breedlove is not a good guy, right? But the genesis of his badness wasn't like this mustache twirling, just inherent evilness, right? The genesis of his badness was the complicated violence of the world, right? You know, and that feels so fucking nourishing to me to encounter in art, right? Like that feels like the world in which I live, right? Where, you know, there aren't a lot of, I mean, we do have our, you know, we have our Elon Musks and our Trumps and whatever, but like, you know, our actual mustache twirling villains, right? But like by and large, like the vast majority of the people that I've met in this life, you know, every day I work with people in recovery who, you know, maybe the sort of drunk who has like a 3 martini lunch and then goes home and sleeps it off without saying anything disparaging to anyone exists, but I've never met them, right? You know, the vast majority of the people that I've met are crass and uncouth and cruel and dishonest and, you know, ethically unhygienic in any number of ways, right? And I believe in rehabilitation, absolutely. Like I believe in rehabilitation, period. There's no but or except on that sentence, right? And so, yeah, Charlie Parker, the musician, was one of my favorite musicians, and he said, "If you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn," right? And I don't think I can be out here, you know, engaging in this sort of like monolithic black and white pop ethics in my life and then go into the art and create like nuanced, complicated characters, right? Like in the same way that you wouldn't be able to be spitting on waiters and clubbing seals and then write like a rigorously honest novel. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to, if you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn. I can't improve upon that, right?
If you have any questions, now's your time. There's a microphone right here. We will get through as many as we can until they cut us off. Yes, please come.
Hi. Hi, Kaveh.
What's your name?
Courtney.
What does your shirt say? Grizzly bear.
I'm delighted you're here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much.
I'm an alcoholic in recovery.
Cool. Thank you for society.
I was sober 2 years this past Saturday. Oh, wow. Yes, I'm so excited.
It's a long ass time to be sober. That rules. Congratulations.
It means a lot to me.
How'd you do it?
One day at a time.
I love it.
It means a lot to me that we have voices like you in the community, like a lot.
Yeah.
And, you know, the single most important thing in the success of my recovery has been to expand my spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. But I find it's really hard to articulate and it's sort of awkward to articulate why that is or how that is.
Yeah.
And so I thought this would be a great opportunity to ask somebody like you, like how your spiritual practice informs your sobriety.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful question. And the center of the atom of everything that I've ever written, right? I mean, I edited the anthology this same year. I did the Penguin anthology. It always takes me so long to remember the title is Don't Tell Penguin. But it's the Penguin Anthology of Spiritual Verse, 110 Poets on the Divine. You can understand why it's a hard title to remember. But, you know, I mean, it's all part of the same gesture, right? Like I will say that, it's such a beautiful and important question. Let me, can I answer it with like a little tiny story?
Sure. Yeah.
Which is like just my therapist is always not annoyed, but like she always makes fun of me for this a little bit because she'll like explain something like really, really beautifully and granularly for 20 minutes, and I'm just not understanding what she's talking about. And then she'll be like, "It's like a bridge," and I'm like, "Oh." uh, but in Islam, there's this story about the first time the devil is inspecting Adam, the first man, right? And the devil, is like Satan, sees Adam, and he doesn't understand what all the fuss is about. He's like, "Oh, he's just like a guy. I don't know. He's just like a squishy, And so in this sort of inspection, he goes into Adam's mouth and passes through his entire body and emerges out his anus. And when he comes out, he's laughing. And he's like, oh, this is going to be easy. Like, this is going to be no problem at all. Man is just a long emptiness. Like, all I have to do is show him stuff that he's going to want to be filled all the time. Like, and all I have to do is show him stuff to fill himself with, right? And so I have tried to fill my empty with alcohol, with any narcotic you can name, with gambling, with sex, with money, with praise, with art, with food. There's not a high in this world I haven't made myself sick off of, right? Because it doesn't stick, right? It just passes right through. The thing that whole seems to be made for is an acknowledgement that there is something larger than ourselves, right? Whether it is a capital G God who sits on a cloud and strokes his beard, or a community, right? Or a family, or a land, or justice, right? But art, right? But there has to be something that is not a thing, and I've spent my entire life trying to fill it with things. Right, and it just falls right out. Right, it has to be something that's not a thing. Does that make sense?
Something intangible.
Yeah. So, and something larger than my own ego too. Right, like money is smaller than my own ego. Alcohol is smaller than my own ego. Right, I have a big ego. Right, but community. Right, like this thing. Like I know you so well. You know me so fucking well because we have this shared language. Right. Yeah. That's so much bigger than my ego. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Kaveh.
Hi.
My name is Max.
Hey, Max, how are you? I love your shirt.
Thank you. We're really going on the shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a line of lovely shirts.
Yeah. As a writer, I think just as important as plot or syntax or character to the moral center or the philosophy of a text is place or land. And I'm curious how writing this book may have affected how you think about your relationship to land, both in the geography of the book itself, as well as the geographies you wrote it in. Especially in this time where it's so contentious, our relationship to land, period, and societally.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Thank you, Max. This is really Clint's purview, especially with the monuments and like what you're doing in Germany. But so I would love to hear what Clint has to say about this too. It's a tricky one for me because I was born in Iran. Farsi was my first language, but I don't really speak it anymore. And I'll never be able to go back to Iran in this lifetime. And so. In a room full of Iranians, I feel like the least Iranian person. In a room full of Americans, I feel like the least American. You know what I mean? There's a way in which there's a kind of liminality that is powerful as a defamiliarist engine, artistically, but, not without its struggle as a psychospiritual entity sat before you. And also, when we came to America, my dad worked on poultry farms, and so we just moved constantly. And so there's no, like, single place that, I'm not like our friend Hanif is like, if you, he's like a Columbus pull string, you know what I mean? Like he'll just like, you pull the string and he'll just tell you a fact about Columbus or someone great who's come from Columbus, you know what I mean? And like, I don't have that with anywhere, you know what I mean? Like I've just never been in a place long enough to have that relationship, and so I think that maybe the most honest answer to your question is that I have long been interested in language art as the form of art with the least. You know, it's like how I'm sorry if there are like lacrosse players in here, but like it's like how rich kids play lacrosse, and like, you know, people from all socioeconomic backgrounds can play basketball, because all you need for basketball is like a ball and a hoop. But what you need, I don't even know how lacrosse works. You need sticks and then like a fancy ball and like face masks, I think.
Social capital.
Yeah, you need social you know what I mean? Like, or like horse polo or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you know, it's like there's a way in which language art, right? There are so many writers, from Phyllis Wheatley and Jupiter Hammond to Anna Akhmatova to you know, there's Nazim Hikmet, who did most of his writing while incarcerated, right? There's so many writers who have affirmed the sanctuary of the imagination as a place in which they can go. You know, like no social institutional fuckshittery could step on. In fact, this is I got to go to the Dartmouth archive. I was speaking at Dartmouth a few months ago, and I got to go to the Dartmouth archives, and they have some of Wheatley's papers. Like they have Phyllis Wheatley is a American enslaved poet originally from Gambia, and they had some of her papers. So before my gig, I got to spend an afternoon just like looking through her papers and like just original drafts of her poem. And I've spoken with Clint about this, but the thing that moved me the most was she had a copy of Alexander Pope's translation of the Iliad. It was like a 3-volume copy, I think. You know, I mean, I'm holding like actual like drafts of poems that she wrote, you know, like this precious shit. And the thing that really, and like first edition copies of her book that were originally, you know, with her signature in them. But the thing that really got me was this copy of the Iliad, which she got when there was a time when her enslavers took her to England, to almost as a sort of like vaudevillian sideshow, right? Like to be like, look at this person this enslaved person who can read and write poetry, right? And in many ways, you know, I think a strong argument could be made that she catalyzed British Romantic poetry. There are like direct lines from her work that are directly plagiarized, or at least very closely paraphrased in Coleridge's essays. But anyways, that's a sort of separate conversation. But what am I talking about? Iliad. So she gets this copy of the Iliad just like 6 months before she's emancipated. And for those of you who know about Wheatley's biographical life, right, she went through a lot of hardship. You know, she gets married, has several miscarriages, has several children die in infancy and young age, and then dies a very young and poor death. And at some point, you know, the provenance is a little unclear, but we know that at some point she had to sell this copy of the Iliad. I'm getting like emotional talking about it. She had to sell this copy of the Iliad, and you know, to just keep, you know, she and her husband were just in a bad way, and I just had this profound urge to return it to her. You know what I mean? Which is completely irrational. But I don't know why I'm even talking. I mean, place, right? I just, it's like, I had this first edition and all these drafts of hers, and I just wanted to return, because it must have been so precious to her, you know, and the thought of her having to sell it. Can you talk about place?
I think the only thing I would say, and we've talked about this before, but like, I think for both of us, you know, place is very prominent in my work. Like, I think for me, there is nothing like putting your physical body in the place where history happened. I think it gives you a very specific, visceral understanding of the sort of proximity, like closing the proximity between you and it closes the proximity between you and that history. But I think in this case also, there's this Alfred Lord Tennyson, the British poet, in his poem Ulysses, has this line where he says, "I am a part of all that I have met." And for me, that's like almost like the thesis statement of life, which is that, and you've talked about this, but like who we are is shaped by every place we've ever been, every person we've ever met, every conversation we've ever had, every piece of art we've consumed, every laugh we've ever shared, every tear we've ever shed. Like, all the confluence of all of those things are what shape the different manifestations of who we are. And so in that sense, you know, place is is omnipresent, I think, as artists, as writers in our work, both regardless of whether or not it is tied specifically to a specific location, right? In the way that it is, Hanif for like Columbus for Hanif, or in many ways New Orleans for me. But that is almost, I think, secondary to the sort of larger confluence of endless places that we've been, that we don't even necessarily consider, that sort of sit in our unconscious, and have shaped and continue to shape who we are.
Thanks.
Like, I'm colorblind, so I don't actually know if this is true, but your shirt seems to match the cover of the book.
It's certainly close, I think. I'm sorry, are we?
Okay, cool.
You gotta be quick.
It's something I'm great at. What's your name?
I'm like sweating with the pressure to be quick.
No, not
Just him.
You don't stop me. Lale?
Lale, it's nice to meet you.
It's a Farsi name, so.
I wondered, but I don't like to be like.
I am Pakistani, but my mom was raised in Tehran, where Shia.
There's so much like Urdu crossover too.
Yeah, so she wanted all us to have Farsi names. But that actually leads into the question I wanted to ask. On account of being raised as a Shia Muslim, martyrdom is like very central.
No.
I feel like everything I learned was like persecution and martyrdom and disaster. Yeah. And so I've been thinking about it my whole life, like kind of involuntarily. Yeah. And I was wondering what angle you came at it from, like what inspired you with it.
Yeah. Okay. So. It's a beautiful, beautiful question. In Shia Islam, there is a veneration of martyrdom that is somewhat unique from Sunni Islam. And in Shia Islam, especially as it's practiced in Iran, there's a veneration specifically around the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, one of the grandchildren of the Prophet, who was martyred in the Battle of Karbala in AD 655, I think. On his birthday. It's called Ashura, and everyone in Iran on that day, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, like that is like some cultural shit. Like you don't fuck around with Ashura. You know what I mean? Like even in America with my like pretty secular family, we wore black to school and we didn't listen to music and we didn't watch TV, and you know what I mean? Like that's like a day in which we're very, very, very reverent, right? Like that is like, and so there's this religious element, there's this cultural element, and then there's this propagandized governmental element, right? Where the Iranian government that came in place after 1979, after the sort of like theocratic takeover, that's a reductive way to describe what happened, but after the theocracy was put in place, the government sort of like really capitalized on this association with the martyrs, right? And so the people who were martyred in the Iran-Iraq War the people who were killed in the Iran-Iraq War were said to be martyrs, right? And their pictures were hung in the mosques. They would hire poets and musicians to play at their graves. They gave the Iran-Iraq War was the first war since World War I to use human wave attacks, which means that if there was like a field full of landmines, they would just send out a wave of guys to clear it instead of laboriously going through. And it was also the first war since World War I to use mustard gas, which even Hitler thought from his brief time in World War I was like, I can't fuck with that. Like, I mean, it was truly, truly just a barbaric war. Barbarism etymologically was used by the Greeks to describe the Persians because they said the Persian language sounded like bar. So all of these forces are inside that word. You know what I mean? Like the politicization of the word martyr in Iran when your son was killed in the war, the soldiers arrive at your house and say, "Congratulations, your son has been martyred." You know what I mean? It's not like we're sad to inform. It's like which is chilling, right? And you're not allowed to be sad about it, right? Like you have to be like, it's this really, really chilling thing. And Cyrus, the protagonist of the novel, becomes really interested in this idea of how he can give his life to something larger than himself, right? He's suicidally sad, but he doesn't want to waste his suicide, right? He wants to give his suicide to something meaningful, whether it's setting himself on fire in front of a Bank of America or, kidnapping a conservative Supreme Court justice or whatever the thing is, right? Like he wants to give his life to something useful, right? And so he goes into learning about martyrs, and then but he's yoked with these sort of like cultural associations, right? Like if he kidnaps a conservative Supreme Court justice, the news isn't going to say like a principled leftist American made a measured and justified, sacrifice for the good of his species, right? It would say a Iranian terrorist kidnapped Brett Kavanaugh. You know what I'm saying? Like and so Jesus, I'm going to be on like every list after this conversation. But you know what I'm saying? And I'm in DC too. Holy shit. Yo, that's crazy. I promise. I'm Persian like the cats, like the rugs, you know what I mean? I'm harmless. But I don't know. Yeah, so all of that's going on in my head. I'm supposed to not keep talking to you now.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, we have one or two. Two more? All right, so let's do, if you can do your questions back to back, and if you can do your...
You're Chloe.
Yeah.
I met you.
I'm Chloe.
Hi, Chloe.
Hi.
Yeah,
So
Chloe's one of the booksellers here. Yeah.
So here's my question. I've seen your book described as a work of autofiction.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with the description or not, but I'm curious about your thoughts on degrees of separation between like author and character, whether they feel important to you, whether they felt important to you while you were writing or not, and like to what degree.
Yeah.
And then next question, also hold that.
Clint's so good at this.
We'll keep going.
Hi. Oh, thank you. I'm actually Iranian.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I'm Mariam. So it's a quick two-part question. One, so I know you.
Clint's face when you say that.
No.
So I've followed your work over the years. I know you're primarily a poet, and I've seen you in conversation with other Iranian American poets, and I think that was really cool. I see also there's a burst of Iranian American fiction writers like Kaveh Akbar and Neda Semnani, all those cool people. Like, how do you see yourself in conversation with them, and how do you how do you interject in that? Like, what is your contribution to their what they're talking about geopolitically? Yeah. And then the other question is about the title as well, but like more on the why the exclamation point? Like, are you what is your interjection here?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer the first two of those three questions with just saying and this is not a cop-out, but I just honestly think it's for someone else to say. You know what I mean? My nose is pressed up to the mural. I can't be like, oh, this is how I relate to Porchista's work, and this is how I relate to Solmaz's work. You know what I mean? That's for someone else to say. I love them all. You know what I mean? I know some of them. I don't know all of that. I actually got to meet Porchista in person for the first time last night. Yeah, that's for someone else to say. And in terms of the autobiography, I mean, Cyrus Shams is a drunk Iranian American poet who, there are some obvious autobiographical symmetries, but I feel like I'm as much him as I am Orkideh, who's the artist that he meets, or Ali, his dad, or Arash, his uncle, or, everyone is just I face a different part of my brain and I write them. You know what I mean? I'm yoked to my subjectivity just like any other writer. With regards to the exclamation point, again, going back to what I was talking about, there's a way in which the exclamation point is a kind of martyr's punctuation, right? Like when you martyr yourself, you go out in a staccato burst, right? You end your life with a staccato burst. I mean, most of us have this. I think the writer Karen Russell wrote this beautiful, beautiful essay about this book, for which I'm eternally grateful. It's like the one of the essays that has been written about this book that really, really penetrated my granite exterior of thinking that everyone is just being nice to me. But she said that the addict's life is just and when an addict dies, it's kind of like a rolling ellipses. That's her language, a rolling ellipses. And the martyr's death is sort of like a staccato burst, like an exclamation, right? It's also just, if I had called the book Martyr, right, it just seems very dour and self-serious. And I think that the exclamation point tells you something about the tone of the book, right? Which is not relentlessly sad at all. I mean, it's about heavy things and there's sadness in it, but like the poems. Do you guys know Ross Gay, the poet? Shout out Ross Gay. When he writes about joy and gratitude, right, which people often say he's like a joyful poet or he's a poet of gratitude, but when he writes about gratitude, like death is always standing in the corner holding his sickle. You know what I mean? Like it's always gratitude. It's always joy made complex by its knowledge of despair, and grief made wise by having known joy, right? And I think that the title gets that. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say is one of the things that is so cool about book talks is that I love the idea, like you like come to a book talk and you hear the writer talk about their work, and then you go home and you read the book and you like hear the writer's voice in your like that is what you have experienced here, and what you will experience with the book is like that to the nth degree. Like you read the book and it like oozes with Kaveh's voice like throughout the whole thing. And I mean that in like the most beautiful, wondrous, whimsical way. So everybody, please give a round of applause for this brilliant man. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. If you've not bought